All right, let's get ready to explore some really fascinating stuff. We're diving deep into the world of witches and spirit travel today. Specifically, we're looking at Michael Howard's book, By Moonlight and Spirit Flight. It's all about that intriguing concept, the witch's Sabbath.
It really is fascinating. The book delves into those myths and legends we've all heard, but it goes deeper,
Right.
exploring the actual practices, the beliefs, the things that might have actually fueled those stories.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about spirit flight. This idea that witches could travel in spirit form, like their soul was leaving their body to go to these gatherings. It's something that, in our modern world, we tend to just dismiss, kind of brush it off as just superstition.
It is interesting, isn't it, how our perspective has changed? Because you think about it, for centuries, cultures all around the world, they didn't dismiss these things. Dreams, for example.
Mm.
They saw them as these direct links to the spirit world, places where gods and spirits could actually communicate with us.
So are you saying maybe our ancestors were onto something? That there's more to it than we think?
It's possible, right? There's so many fascinating examples in the book, like, the ancient Greeks. They had temples dedicated to dream incubation. They'd go there, hoping to receive divine messages in their dreams. And the ancient Egyptians, they had these dream interpreters, these Wanericrits, who were tasked with deciphering messages from the gods in people's dreams.
And even Carl Jung, like a prominent psychologist,
Hmm.
he believed that all those symbols we see in our dreams, they come from this collective unconscious, this like reservoir of shared human experience.
Exactly. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, dreams are more than just some random firings happening in our brains. What if they are gateways to other realms of consciousness, other realities we don't fully understand?
Okay, so maybe dreams hold a key to understanding this whole spirit flight thing. But what about the classic image, right? Witches flying on broomsticks. Was that meant to be taken literally, or was it more symbolic?
That's where the book dives into the concept of what it calls spirit flight. And it's not talking about physical flight, like defying gravity. It's describing an ecstatic out-of-body experience. Think of it like the soul is literally leaving the body and journeying to other realms.
So less about soaring through the air and more like what, astral projection, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's about the spirit, not the body,
Yeah.
traveling. In fact, there's this great quote in the book from a 17th century poem by Henry Moore. He describes it as like, witches' souls are attending feasts while their bodies are back at home, sound asleep.
Wow, okay, that's pretty wild. But if they weren't physically flying, how did they achieve the spirit flight? Was it just pure willpower? Like, did they just will themselves out of their bodies?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting. This is where the infamous flying ointment comes into play.
Ah, yes, the infamous flying ointment. The concoction with all the crazy ingredients, right? Like bat's blood, the fat of unbaptized babies, all those spooky things you hear about.
Right, but a lot of those specific ingredients, they're probably more myth than reality,
Mm.
sensationalized to make it sound even scarier. The more likely scenario, they used a blend of powerful psychoactive plants, things like belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and often mix those with animal fats as a base.
So you're saying those ingredients weren't just for shock value, they actually served a purpose.
Exactly. These plants, they have incredibly powerful effects on both the mind and body. We're talking altered states of consciousness, hallucinations, even sensations of flying. It's like they were creating a recipe for spiritual journeying, a way to chemically alter their perception and experience these other realms.
And the book actually backs this up, right? I mean, there are historical accounts that suggest these ointments were more than just spooky folklore.
Oh, absolutely. There are records from witch trials, observations from people who witnessed these things firsthand, and even some modern experiments that all seem to suggest these ointments were really doing something.
Okay, you've got me hooked. Give me some examples. What kind of historical accounts are we talking about?
All right, so let's go back to 13th century Ireland. There was this trial of Dame Alice Keitler, who was accused of witchcraft. And get this, during a search of her home, they actually found an ointment she allegedly used to gallop through thick and thin.
So even way back then, they were associating this ointment with some kind of supernatural movement.
Precisely. And it doesn't stop there. Let's jump ahead to the 16th century. We have Giambattista Porta, a writer and scholar. He claimed to have actually witnessed a witch applying an ointment and then falling into a trance. And when she was in this trance, she described these vivid journeys, even giving him specific information about a town far away, information that he later verified to be true.
Wow, okay. That's pretty compelling. It doesn't sound like she was just imagining things. It seems like she really experienced something.
Right. And fast forward again to the 17th century to the Somerset witch trials. There's this testimony from a woman named Elizabeth Style, and she described using a greenish ointment to travel to the Sabbath. She even recited the charms she used for flying there and returning.
It's incredible how these accounts pop up across different time periods and cultures. It's like a persistent thread in human history.
It really is. And it forces us to ask, were these experiences purely psychological? Or were they hinting at something beyond our current understanding of reality? Something beyond what we can explain with science?
Okay, but hold on. If this ointment was so powerful, did everyone who used it end up at the Sabbath? Or were there other ways to achieve spirit flight?
That's a great question. And the book explores another fascinating concept, the fetch. This idea of a spirit double that could travel independently from the body, like a ghostly twin, capable of appearing to others or even interacting with the physical world.
Like if someone injured a hare in the woods and then later found a corresponding wound on a suspected witch. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. That could have been their fetch, their spirit double, out and about. And there are even historical accounts that seem to back this up. In the 15th century, Ulrich Molitor describes Saint Germain witnessing a peasant's spirit double feasting with others. And in the 13th century, a French inquisitor documented a woman who saw her neighbor's fetch entering her home, even though the neighbor was supposedly asleep in bed.
So these were just stories. People were genuinely reporting these experiences. It's almost like a precursor to modern ideas about astral projection.
It's a fascinating parallel, for sure, but it still leaves us with the big question. What exactly was this witch's Sabbath they were traveling to? Was it really all demonic rituals and wild orgies, like the Inquisition claimed?
Right. That's the classic image, but was it accurate? Or was it more nuanced than that?
Well, the picture painted by the church was definitely dramatic. They had a vested interest in making it sound as terrifying as possible. But some historians believe the Sabbath might have had pre-Christian origins, that it was later demonized by the church to fit their narrative.
So instead of worshiping the devil, maybe it was more like an ancient pagan gathering, a continuation of older traditions.
Exactly. The book mentions these early accounts of good women riding with pagan goddesses and attending games, suggesting a whole world of folk magic and beliefs that were later swept up in the witch hunts. It's like the church took something ancient and powerful and twisted it to fit their own agenda.
It's fascinating how history gets rewritten and reinterpreted over time, isn't it? It makes you wonder what else we might have gotten wrong or lost along the way.
Absolutely. But let's get back to the Sabbath itself. What did it actually involve? Typically, you'd have an assembly of witches, homage to some kind of leader figure, a feast, dancing, and yes, sometimes there were stories of orgies. But honestly, those might have been exaggerated by the Inquisition for shock value, to demonize these gatherings even further.
Right. Makes sense. A good party never hurt anyone, even if it's happening in spirit form. But I'm curious about how they actually got to this Sabbath. We talked about spirit paths earlier. Did they follow specific routes in the spirit world? Like, were there maps?
That's a key question, and it's something we'll explore in more detail later on. But you bring up a crucial point. It wasn't just about flying. It was about navigating a spiritual landscape, knowing the paths and the landmarks of the other world. And that takes a special kind of knowledge.
Okay, you've definitely got my attention. I'm ready to dive into those spirit paths and see where they lead.
Let's do it. So we're talking about these spirit paths, right? And these weren't just like random routes through the spirit world. It was like there was some kind of system to it, like a hidden network, almost like they were woven into the fabric of reality itself, you know?
Okay, yeah, I get that. But were they just paths in the spirit world? Or did they, like, have some kind of physical counterparts in the real world?
That's where it gets really interesting. The book connects these spirit paths to Lowy lines, you know, those alignments in the landscape, the ones some people believe connect ancient sacred sites. It's suggesting that witches might have been drawn to these places, not just in spirit, but like physically too.
Oh, okay. So those sites, they were like points of convergence, where that veil between the worlds was super thin, and it made spirit travel easier.
Exactly. And there's this other interesting thing. In lots of shamanic traditions, spirits are believed to travel in straight lines, which, you know, lines up perfectly with the whole Deckley line concept.
It's like those alignments, they tap into something fundamental about the spirit world, like some kind of universal energetic grid.
Right. And think about those death roads and fairy paths we were talking about earlier, the ones that often ended up at, like graveyards or burial mounds, places already associated with, you know, death, mystery. Those places could have been gateways, portals between the worlds.
Yeah, this is where the line between the living and the dead was all blurry. perfect for spirit travel, I guess.
Exactly. And the book even points out this really specific detail. Back in medieval times, they often carried corpses along these specific routes, even when there were easier roads to take.
Whoa, so they were literally following in the footsteps of the dead. That's kind of creepy, but it makes sense symbolically, right?
Yeah, totally. It strengthens that link between spirit flight, death, and, the whole idea of crossing over to the other world.
But how did they even keep track of these spirit paths? Like, did they just memorize them? Were there maps or actual, like, markers along the way?
I think it was probably a mix of things. Over time, those spiritual alignments probably got tied to physical landmarks, think ancient trackways, standing stones, burial mounds, like the spiritual map. It was imprinted onto the landscape itself.
So they could follow the physical markers, but they also had to, like, tune in to the subtle energies of the land to actually find their way.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they were reading the landscape on multiple levels,
Mhm.
combining their knowledge of the physical terrain with this sensitivity to the unseen world.
That's pretty amazing. But this whole spirit flight and witches Sabbath thing, it wasn't just something from the past, right? Like, the book mentions people are still exploring these ideas today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are groups today, like the Cult of Sabati, led by this guy, Andrew D. Chumbley, and they see the Sabbath as a living tradition. They draw on practices passed down through like generations of traditional witchcraft.
So it's not just about reinventing the wheel, but about carrying on that lineage of knowledge and practice.
Exactly. And they have this ritual. It's called going forth by night. It's their version of spirit flight, basically. But instead of using a flying ointment, get this, they use a horse-headed rod. It's a symbolic steed. And they do all these dream control techniques to access the Sabbath.
Wait, a horse-headed rod? That's got to be intense. Like, is it some kind of magical staff? What's with the horse head?
It's like it represents their spirit mount. It's a guide through the other world, like a modern take on the whole broomstick imagery.
Oh, that's really cool. Bridging that gap between tradition and modern practice, it's like they're tapping into that ancient energy, but adapting it for today.
Exactly. It just goes to show how powerful those concepts are, the idea that we can break free from the limitations of our physical bodies, connect with something bigger than ourselves.
For sure. But the cult of Sabati isn't the only modern example. We were talking about Austin Osman's Spare earlier. What's his connection to all this?
Oh, Spare is a fascinating character. He was this 20th century artist and an occultist, super into traditional witchcraft, and he was convinced the Sabbath was real. He even claimed he learned about it from, get this, an elderly witch who said she was descended from the Salem witches.
Whoa, hold on. Like a direct link to the past? That's wild. But was he just a theorist? Or did he actually practice magic?
Oh, he definitely practiced. There's this chilling story about him summoning an elemental for some skeptical guests. It didn't end well.
Okay, now you've got me really intrigued. Tell me about this elemental summoning.
So the story goes, he drew this magical sigil, muttered some kind of spell, and all of a sudden there's this greenish mist. Starts forming into this shadowy figure with glowing eyes.
Yeah, okay, I'm getting goosebumps just hearing about it.
Yeah, right. And then, well, one of the guests supposedly died soon after. And the other one, well, went mad. Whether it's true or just a spooky tale, who knows? But it definitely adds to Spare's mystique.
I can see why. It's like a reminder that messing with forces you don't understand can have some serious consequences. But back to Spare and the Sabbath. What was his take on it? Was it just about attending a party in the spirit world? Or was it something deeper?
Well, for Spare, the Sabbath was a source of power. He believed it could be accessed through sexual magic. Like the energy generated during ritual could be harnessed to, manifest desires, achieve magical goals. And his art, it often depicted scenes from the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Like he was giving us a glimpse into this otherworldly realm he was tapping into.
So it wasn't just a gathering. It was about like tapping into a primal force and using it to shape reality. It's a very different perspective than the whole evil witches worshiping the devil narrative, but it's super fascinating.
Exactly. And it just shows how diverse beliefs and practices can be,
Yeah.
even when we're talking about something like witchcraft.
Yeah.
But, thinking about all this, spirit flight, the Sabbath, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
About what?
Well, if these experiences are real, even if it's just as journeys of the mind and soul, what does that say about reality itself? Like, what other realms might be out there just waiting to be explored?
That's a really good question. And who knows, maybe we'll uncover some answers as we keep digging into this. It's wild, right? Like we all know those stories about witches flying on broomsticks, but when you start thinking about them actually navigating these like intricate spirit paths. It has a whole other layer to it.
It really does. It's not just about, flying. It's like a whole spiritual cartography thing.
Yeah.
They had to understand those subtle energies, the hidden pathways of the other world.
Yeah, and it makes you think these witches, they weren't just magically inclined, right? They had to be incredibly knowledgeable about the landscape too, like both physically and spiritually.
Oh, for sure. They probably had this, like, intense awareness of the natural world. They could read the land like a map, see those subtle signs and landmarks that most people would just, totally miss.
It's like they were walking between worlds, one foot in the physical, the other in the spirit realm.
And don't forget, those paths weren't just for getting to the Sabbath either. They could use them for all sorts of magic. Healing, divination, talking to spirits, even like influencing things happening in the physical world.
Whoa, okay, so those paths, they were more than just routes to a destination. They were like channels of power,
Yes,
conduits for magic itself.
exactly. And Michael Howard, the author, he suggests that those spirit lines might still be accessible today. Like they're remnants of this ancient energy system that covers the whole globe.
Wait, are you saying we could tap into those energies, like, even now?
It's a possibility, right?
Hmm.
Howard thinks you can access them through altered states of consciousness. Things like meditation, dream work, or even just spending time in nature, really tuning in to the energies of the land.
That's pretty mind-blowing. Who knows what we could learn, what secrets are hidden along those paths?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? And it brings us back to that question we were wrestling with before. What is spirit flight, really? Was it like an actual physical journey? Or was it something more symbolic, internal? A journey of the soul, a transformation of consciousness?
I think that's what makes this whole topic so cool. There's no one right answer. You can look at it from a historical perspective, a scientific one, a mystical one, and each one reveals something different, something new to consider.
And maybe, maybe the real answer is somewhere in between all those perspectives. Maybe spirit flight was both literal and symbolic, like a merging of the physical and the spiritual, a testament to what human consciousness can really do.
I love that. And it makes me think about the witches' Sabbath itself. Was it a real gathering in a physical place? Or more like a shared dream, a collective experience in some realm beyond what we normally perceive?
It could be both, couldn't it? Or neither. Maybe it existed on like multiple levels of reality, a place you could only access through altered states of consciousness, where the lines between physical and spiritual just like dissolved.
That's a lot to wrap your head around. And it makes you wonder if the Sabbath was real, whatever form it took, what secrets did it hold, what mysteries were revealed there.
Those are questions people have been asking for centuries.
Yeah.
And we might never have definite answers.
Yeah.
But just asking the questions, exploring the possibilities, it can change how we see the world, how we see ourselves.
Totally. It reminds us that there's still so much we don't know, so much mystery out there to explore, and maybe that's where the real magic lies. In the searching, in the questioning, that never-ending pursuit of understanding.
Well said. And for everyone listening, if you're as fascinated by this as we are, check out the show notes. We've got links to Michael Howard's book and a bunch of other resources on spirit flight and the witch's Sabbath. It's a deep rabbit hole, trust me.
Yeah, definitely check those out if you want to keep learning. And as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought to leave you with. Whether we believe in spirit flight literally or not, the concept itself challenges us to think bigger, to consider those hidden dimensions of reality, and to embrace that mystery that's at the heart of being human.
It's a reminder that there's always more to discover, more to see, if we're willing to look beyond what's right in front of us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of spirit flight and the witch's Sabbath. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, keep exploring.